I didn't fall apart when they showed up at my door. I'm 67 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you any of this. I have never been the kind of woman who falls apart easily. My mother raised me on the prairies outside of Saskatoon, where winters came fast and hard, and you learned early that crying didn't keep the pipes from freezing. So when my son's wife knocked on my door that Tuesday morning in February, with a lawyer standing behind her on my front porch, I looked at them both, and I said, "Come in, if you're coming in, it's cold." But I'm getting ahead of myself. My son's name is Oliver. He's 34 now. When he was born, the doctor told me he was perfect, and I believed him. The way you believe doctors when you're 23 and you don't yet know that the word perfect doesn't mean what you think it means. Oliver was perfect. He was also, by the time he was 3, clearly wired differently than other children. He didn't speak the way other toddlers spoke. He lined things up. Canned goods along the baseboards, his shoes facing the same direction always, the remote controls arranged by size on the coffee table. His father thought it was funny at first. Quirky, he called it. Quirky kid. I wasn't so sure. By the time Oliver was 5, we had a diagnosis. Autism spectrum disorder, level 2. His father, who had thought the lining up of canned goods was charming, did not handle the diagnosis well. Within 18 months, he had moved out, moved on, and eventually moved to Fort McMurray for work, which in our family became a kind of shorthand for disappeared. He sent birthday cards for a few years. Then he didn't. So it was me. Just me and Oliver in a small house in Fredericton, New Brunswick, trying to figure out what his life was going to look like. I won't romanticize it. It was hard. The school system was not designed for him, and I fought it every single year. I had meetings I had to take time off work to attend. I had phone calls from teachers who meant well and understood nothing. I had nights where Oliver was so overwhelmed that he couldn't come down from it for hours, and I would sit outside his bedroom door on the floor in the hallway just so he could hear me breathing, because sometimes that was the only thing that helped. But Oliver was also extraordinary in ways that took my breath away on a regular basis. He understood patterns the way other people understand breathing, automatically, effortlessly, without having to try. At 7, he could tell you the exact date of any day of the week going back 20 years. At 9, he taught himself binary code from a library book. At 12, he built a functioning weather tracking program on an old laptop I bought him secondhand at a garage sale. His teacher that year sent home a note saying Oliver was disruptive in class. I sent one back that said he was bored. We found our rhythm, Oliver and I. It wasn't always easy. There were things he couldn't do or couldn't do the way other people did them, and I learned which battles to fight and which ones to let go. He didn't make friends easily. He preferred order to spontaneity, patterns to surprises. He communicated better in writing than in person, but he was happy in his way, and he was mine, completely and fully, and I was his, and for a long time that felt like enough. When Oliver was 22, he met a woman through an online forum he participated in, something to do with open source software. I never fully understood it. Her name was Justine. She was from Moncton, sharp and quick-talking and very beautiful, and she made Oliver laugh in a way I hadn't heard before. I was cautious. I want to be honest about that. I was cautious because I knew my son, and I knew that he trusted completely or not at all, and that if someone wanted to take advantage of that, they could. But Justine seemed genuine. She seemed to understand him, or at least to be trying to. They dated for 2 years. They got married in the small ceremony at a vineyard outside of Wolfville on a Saturday in September, and Oliver wore a navy suit and stood very still at the altar, the way he always stood when he was concentrating hard on something, and I cried, which I almost never do. For the first year, things were fine. Oliver had been working remotely as a developer for a firm in Toronto, steady salary, good benefits, quiet work he could do from home in the order and structure he needed. Justine worked in marketing. They rented a nice apartment in Fredericton, not far from me. I had dinner with them every Sunday. Then Oliver started working on something on his own time. He'd been thinking about it for years, he told me. A scheduling and communication platform specifically designed for neurodiverse adults in the workplace. Something that could translate the gap between how they processed information and how most workplaces communicated. He'd mapped the whole architecture out in a series of notebooks going back to when he was 19. He just needed the time and the space to build it properly. Justine did not take kindly to the time it required. I noticed it first at Sunday dinners. Small comments. He's always on that laptop. He forgets I'm in the room. He doesn't come to bed until 2 a.m. I listened. I didn't say much because it wasn't my place, but I knew Oliver. I knew that when he was close to something, he went toward it with everything he had. That wasn't a flaw. That was just him. The dinner invitation started thinning out. Then they stopped. Oliver and I texted, but I could feel a distance opening up and I didn't fully understand it. When I finally drove over unannounced one Sunday in March, Justine answered the door with a look I couldn't read, and Oliver was at his desk in the back room, and the apartment felt like two separate silences living under the same roof. 6 months later, Oliver called me. His voice was very flat, the way it got when he was containing something large. He told me that Justine had moved out, that she had told him she couldn't live like this, that he was incapable of real connection, that his work always came before her, that she needed someone who could be present. He repeated the words incapable of real connection twice, like he was still trying to understand them. I drove to his apartment that evening and I sat with him, and I didn't tell him she was wrong, because I didn't think she was entirely wrong, but I also didn't tell him she was right, because I didn't think the whole truth lived in one sentence like that. Oliver finished the platform 14 months later. He called it ClearBridge. He launched it quietly, the way he did everything. No announcement, no fanfare, just a product page and a few posts in the online communities he'd been part of for years. Within 3 months, a mid-sized company in Vancouver had signed on. Within 6 months, 2 firms in Calgary had followed. Within a year, a national accessibility organization had published a case study about ClearBridge, and that case study got picked up by a technology publication out of Toronto. And then something happened that Oliver had not anticipated, and I had not anticipated, and probably nobody had fully anticipated. The story of a young autistic man from New Brunswick who had built a workplace tool specifically because systems had never been built for people like him went, in the particular way that things go now, everywhere. The licensing deal came in the spring. I don't know all the details because Oliver didn't share all the details, but I know it was signed with a firm out of Waterloo, and I know the number attached to it was $2.7 million. And I know this because Oliver drove to my house on a Wednesday afternoon and sat at my kitchen table and told me, quietly, the way he told me everything that mattered. I made tea. We sat there for a while without saying much. Then he said, I didn't think it would actually work this big. And I said, I did. 3 weeks after that conversation, Justine called me. Not Oliver. Me. She called my cell phone on a Thursday evening while I was washing dishes, and when I saw her name on the screen, I stood very still for a moment before I answered. She was friendly. Too friendly. Too friendly. She asked how I was, asked about my hip, which I'd been having trouble with the previous winter, asked whether Oliver and I had been spending time together. I answered carefully, the way you answer when you know a conversation has a destination and you haven't been shown the map yet. Then she said she'd heard about ClearBridge, said she was so proud of him, said she'd been thinking a lot lately about how hard things had been between them, about whether she'd handled things fairly, about whether she'd understood what Oliver was going through. She used the word neurodivergent, which she had never used when they were married, and something cold moved through me when I heard it. She said she thought she and Oliver should talk. I said I thought that was something Oliver would have to decide for himself. She said, of course. I just wanted to reach out to you first because I always felt close to you. I said yes, and I got off the phone and I stood at my kitchen sink for a long time. I didn't tell Oliver that night. I thought about it for 2 days, and then I told him, word for word, everything she had said. He listened. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, okay, just okay. And I said, do you want to talk to her? And he said, I'll think about it. He didn't call her back. She showed up instead. Not at his apartment, at mine. On a Tuesday morning in February, the way I told you at the beginning, with a lawyer standing on my porch behind her in the cold, like this was something that had been planned carefully, which of course it had. I let them in because it was -17 and also because I needed to know what this was. The lawyer's name was something I immediately forgot. He was young, very pressed-looking, with a leather portfolio he set on my kitchen table without asking. Justine sat across from me and she looked polished and very rehearsed, and I thought, she has practiced this conversation. She had practiced it, and she had brought documentation, and she had brought a lawyer, and she was sitting in my kitchen where Oliver had sat 3 weeks ago, telling me about the licensing deal, and the air in the room felt different now. The argument as the lawyer presented it was this. During the marriage, Justine had contributed financially to the household while Oliver developed ClearBridge. Her income had allowed him to reduce his hours at his day job and dedicate significant time to the platform. She was therefore entitled to a portion of the proceeds from the licensing deal under the framework of unjust enrichment. She wasn't asking for everything. The lawyer said that twice. She's not asking for everything. He named a number. It was significant. I sat very quietly through all of this. I'm good at being quiet. Oliver used to tell me when he was small that I was the only person who knew how to be quiet the right way, and I took that as one of the better compliments I've ever received. When the lawyer finished, I said, "Does Oliver know you're here?" Justine said she had texted him. She had texted him that morning, while they were presumably already in the car on the way over. I thought about that for a moment. I said, I'm not a lawyer, and this is not my decision to make. But I'd like you to know that I have kept records. I have kept records for a very long time, because when you have a child who the world doesn't always treat fairly, you learn to document everything. I have dates. I have the timeline of when Oliver started developing ClearBridge and when he began reducing his hours. I have records of the money I lent him during that period, money that came from me, not from the household income. I have the emails he sent me when things were hardest. I have a lot of things. The lawyer looked at his portfolio. I said, I'm also going to call my son now, if you don't mind. Oliver answered on the second ring. He already knew what was happening. He'd gotten her text and 2 more after it while I was talking. I said very little. I said, your ex-wife is at my house with a lawyer, and they've made a financial claim, and I think you should come. He said, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't sign anything. I almost smiled. I said, I know, sweetheart. He was there in 8 minutes. He came in the side door, the way he always came in. And he didn't look at Justine when he came in. He looked at me first, the way he'd been doing since he was very small, that quick checking-in look. And I nodded once to tell him I was fine. Then he sat down. Oliver does not perform emotions. This is something people have sometimes read as coldness, and I have spent 34 years understanding that it is not coldness, it is simply a different architecture. He sat at my kitchen table and he opened his laptop, which he had brought with him, and he said to the lawyer, I assume you filed nothing yet, since this is clearly a preliminary conversation. The lawyer said they were exploring options. Oliver said, I'd like to show you something. He turned the laptop around. He had a folder open, a folder I'd never seen before, organized with the kind of precision that was purely Oliver. Everything labeled, everything dated. He walked them through it methodically, the timeline of ClearBridge's development, going back to notebooks he had scanned and saved from when he was 19 years old, years before he met Justine. The financial records from his own account showing the source of every dollar spent during development, the documentation of the loan from me, the dates of every conversation he'd had with investors, which all predated the separation, his own reduced hours at his job, which he had documentation to show were offset by his own savings, not by any increase in Justine's contributions. And then last he opened something else. He said, "I'd also like you to see this." It was a message thread. Justine's messages to a contact in her phone, going back about 8 months, messages that had been sent to Oliver accidentally, a forward that had included the original thread. Something small and careless that she probably hadn't realized he had. The messages were detailed. They were about Clearbridge. They were about timing. They referenced the licensing deal and a figure close to the actual number, and were dated 3 months before the deal had been publicly announced. There was a name in those messages I didn't recognize, and the lawyer clearly recognized it because his expression changed. Oliver closed the laptop. He said, "I don't want anything from you. I want you to understand that I have documentation for everything, that any claim will be contested thoroughly, and that this folder has already been shared with my own legal representation. If you'd like to proceed, we can do that. But I want you to understand what you're proceeding into." Justine hadn't said a word since Oliver sat down. She looked, for the first time since she'd walked through my door, like herself, like the unpolished version, the one I'd met years ago before she had a reason to perform anything. She looked like someone who had calculated wrong. The lawyer said they would need to consult further with their client. Oliver said that was fine and closed his laptop and stood up. I offered them tea before they left because that is just how I was raised, and they declined, which was probably the right call. After the door closed, Oliver and I stood in my kitchen for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window above the sink, the way it does in late winter in New Brunswick, low and pale and thin. He put his laptop under his arm and he looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry they came here." I said, "Don't be sorry. I'm glad they came here." He almost smiled. Oliver's almost smiles were always my favorite kind. I made tea anyway for the two of us, and we sat at the table where all of it had just happened, and I asked him how he'd known to have all of that ready, and he said he'd started preparing the folder the day Justine called me, that when I told him about that phone call, word for word, the way I always tried to tell him things, word for word, because that was what he needed, not a summary, not my interpretation, but the actual words. He'd heard something in the phrasing, incapable of real connection. She had used that phrase again on the phone with me, the same one she'd used when she left, and he'd thought about why someone would use the exact same phrase years later, after a licensing deal, and he'd started building the folder that evening. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "You know she might try again." He said, "I know, but it'll be harder the second time." We drank our tea. Outside, the snow was coming down, the way it does in February in New Brunswick, quietly, steadily, the kind of snow that accumulates without drama. Oliver had to leave by 4 to get back to a call with his legal team in Waterloo. He hugged me at the door, a brief, firm hug, the kind he'd given me since he was about 14 and had decided that was the appropriate duration, and I held on for exactly as long as he held on, not longer. After he left, I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway. There's something I want to say before I finish. It's something I've been thinking about since all of this happened, since the lawyer and the folder and the thin winter light in my kitchen. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. Raising Oliver alone, they mean, usually, all those years. And I understand why they ask that, because it's the part that looks hard from the outside. The school meetings and the late nights in the hallway and the father who went to Fort McMurray and the world that was not built for my son. But the hardest part was never any of that. The hardest part was the years I spent worrying that the world was going to look at Oliver and see only what he couldn't do. See only the gaps. See only the diagnosis. The level 2. The boy who lined up canned goods along the baseboards. I was so afraid for so long that the world was going to decide he was less. And then he built something that $2.7 million later nobody could argue was less. He built it because his brain worked the way it worked, because he saw patterns other people couldn't see, because he spent years in a world that didn't fit him and decided to make something that would fit people like him instead. That is not in spite of who he is. That is exactly who he is. I'm 67 years old. I've lived long enough to know that the people who come back after the money rarely fool anyone who's been paying attention, and I have always been paying attention. That's all I wanted to tell you. The afternoon Oliver left my house that day, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the snow coming down, and I thought about cause and consequence. Not in any grand or dramatic way, just the quiet, plain version of it that life keeps teaching you if you're willing to sit still long enough to learn. Justine made a choice years ago. She decided that Oliver's silences were absence, that his focus was neglect, that a man who couldn't perform connection the way she expected it to look wasn't capable of it at all. That was her right. People leave marriages for all kinds of reasons, and I've never thought leaving automatically makes someone a villain. But there's a difference between leaving because something isn't working and returning only after a number gets attached to someone's name. That difference is the whole thing. That's where the cause lives, and it's also where the consequence grows from. What strikes me still is the integrity Oliver carried through all of it. Not integrity as a concept, not something he talked about or announced, just the plain daily version of it. He built Clearbridge because he saw a real problem, and he had the particular kind of mind that could solve it. He documented everything not because he suspected Justine, but because that's how he'd always operated. Carefully, methodically, with a respect for truth that came from spending his whole life in a world that hadn't always told the truth about him. He didn't build his folder out of bitterness. He built it out of habit. And that habit, that quiet, consistent honesty he'd practiced for years without anyone watching, was exactly what protected him when it mattered. I think about that a lot, how the things we do when nobody's paying attention are the things that end up mattering most. Oliver spent years developing not just a platform, but a way of moving through the world, precise, thorough, unintimidated by complexity. That wasn't luck. That was the result of a mind that never stopped working, never stopped asking questions, never accepted that the existing system was the only possible system. The intelligence he brought to Clearbridge was the same intelligence he brought to that laptop at my kitchen table. You can't fake that. You can't arrive at it last minute. It accumulates, slowly, over years, and it shows up exactly when it's needed. And the perseverance, I keep coming back to that. Oliver spent his whole childhood in systems that weren't built for him. He spent his marriage feeling misunderstood in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He spent years building something in the quiet, in the margins of his regular job, without guarantees, without much encouragement from the people closest to him. That kind of sustained effort, the kind that doesn't require applause to keep going, is rare. It's not something you can manufacture after the fact. It's either been built into you over time, or it hasn't. I'm 67. I've watched a lot of things play out over the years, and I've learned the outcomes rarely come from nowhere. What happened in my kitchen that Tuesday in February was not luck or coincidence. It was the result of decades of small, quiet choices. To be honest, to keep records, to stay curious, to keep going even when the world made it harder than it needed to be. Oliver called me that evening after he'd finished his call with his legal team in Waterloo. He didn't say much. He asked if I'd had dinner. I said I had. He said good. That was most of it. But I knew, and he knew I knew. And in our family, That has always been enough.